This is a Radical Exchange production. Hello and welcome to Radical Exchanges. In today's episode, Matt Prewitt talks to Victoria Ivanova, starting with the question of how we can best mobilize the artistic and cultural sectors to offer a critical and actionable approach to our current technological conditions while keeping democratic ideals in mind. They go on to explore a whole range of topics, from the role of art in the Industrial Revolution to its current crisis of meaning in our age of accelerationism and powerful AI. It expands on the recent paper they wrote, along with Paula Berman, titled Rethinking Art Ownership, in which they explore the ways that partial common ownership, or plural property, could create a more fair and dynamic market for art. This episode and the paper are a collaboration between Radical Exchange and Serpentine Arts. Victoria is a curator, writer, and strategic consultant. She is currently working with the Serpentine Arts Technologies team as R&D strategist. She is also the co-founder of Izolyacja, RealFlow, and Bureau for Cultural Strategies. Without further ado, here is Matt Prewitt and Victoria Ivanova.
Victoria Ivanova, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you.
Yeah, so happy to be here.
Maybe can we start with you telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, well, currently I am an R&D strategist working at a visual arts organization in London called Serpentine. I work as part of the Arts Technologies department, so we commission artists who work with advanced technologies to produce new artworks. And I kind of started on this sort of pathway of developing my current role when I first joined Serpentine in 2018 as a practice-based PhD student. And the question that was posed sort of to me or in front of me was, how could we design an R&D department in a context of an art institution? And that's a somewhat unusual question as far as PhD questions are concerned, but and not just because we were developing this department through the prism of my PhD, but also because R&D is not something that we usually associate with the role of public arts institutions. The reason that seemed like a relevant and worthwhile pursuit, particularly in the context of a public arts organization, is because we realized that with increasing ubiquity of technology in society and technological development itself becoming a widespread cultural formation, kind of the artistic perspective on that process was quite unique and perhaps quite important in a context of technological development that's largely informed by interests of proprietary, kind of market-oriented commercial actors, or informed by interests relating to power and control. So the artist position, historically has always been one that kind of questions power constellations, and that also tries to think creatively about the most pertinent issues to our current condition, as well as to the various new media that are emerging within our technosocial societies. So the R&D part of the organization that I developed since 2018, and my role was part of that developmental process, or the emergence of my role was part of that developmental process, is, it's very much dedicated to this larger question as to how can we best mobilize the public arts sector, that's in the case of the UK, but arts more generally, in order to offer a critical, but also kind of actionable and impactful approach to the current technological conditions, with hopefully a progressive societal mission in mind. So that's where I am now. But my background is in human rights, actually. So it's a bit further afield to art. And the jump that I had made more than a decade ago, actually much more than a decade ago, I stopped counting years, was sort of understanding that the legal lens on addressing problems of structural injustice is an important lens, but it's also very limited as far as dealing with kind of nuances of social and societal specificities are concerned. And so I was always very interested in like understanding whether we can take the human rights mission, but utilize, let's say, cultural tools in the cultural space in order to address similar issues. So yeah, there are many different kind of obviously chapters and sub-chapters that I could go into, but I think for our current conversation, that's probably the two most relevant areas.
That's great. We share an intuition that art has a very important role to play in helping society confront power and grapple with power, and also grapple with the related questions of technology. And RadicalxChange and Serpentine are working together on projects exploring new ways of thinking about the relationship between property rights and art. But there is a much bigger question here that you alluded to that I'd love to get into a little bit more about, like the role that art plays in helping society through important moments, important confrontations with power and technology and things like that. So just to sort of, I think what I'll do is I'll throw out a couple ideas. I'll vomit up a couple ways that I think about this, and I'd love to know how you react or how you think about it. Okay. So like when I look back on the past couple centuries of art history and think about the important sort of social or moral contributions that art has made, some interesting things that come to mind to me. I mean, one of the most fascinating things to me is the, oh gosh, my art history vocabulary is going to
fail me here,
but like the sort of like realist painting and realist literature of like the mid 19th century, right? So that kind of stuff like that. So you've got and there's the painters, there's like Courbet, and then
the modernist who sort of set the kind of paradigm of what we still understand as a kind of critical role of art in society.
Yeah, and so what and like
term,
and my sort of slightly ignorant understanding of what's going on with that art is that those artists they're portraying ordinary people with a sort of a dignity and an attention that creates a different way of seeing the world, creates a different way of seeing class relations and stuff like that. So a couple other examples that are really important to me, have been influential to me, are Harry Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and A Sportsman's Sketches, which is a book by Ivan Turgenev. Those two books are both really, they're quite different, but they're both really, really amazing in this regard. They're like these kind of deeply humanistic portraits of people who are oppressed, enslaved people in the United States and serfs in Russia. And both these books were published in the 1850s, and in the 1860s, you had the Civil War in the United States and the emancipation of the serfs in Russia. And so there's, it's a kind of an unresolvable historical question about whether these works of literature, had a causal role in those social changes. But I think it's actually sort of plausible, because both of them created a real stir. Both of them created a real like moral reckoning, like the sort of comfortable upper classes of the United States and Russia were forced to really look in the mirror in a way when they grappled with these works of literature. And there's a case to be made that played a role in the social change that followed. One other quick example, just to overload my brain dump here, is
the preamble.
Yeah.
I'm already mentally taking notes because I think we look at these things from slightly different perspective, which will be interesting to get into in a moment. Okay, but yeah, continue.
Yeah. Okay, then the other one is Futurism, Italian Futurism, right? Which again, people that I respect enormously kind of totally see it in a completely different way than I do. But I see Futurism as really disturbing. I see Futurism as like a real kind of naive embrace of some of this sort of accelerationist energy that really was leading the world into to disaster. And that was, I think, Futurism is one of the most like salient and interesting examples of art grappling very, very directly with what is extremely legible to us as modern technology, and just for the benefit of listeners, they don't have to flip open their art history book. Like, Italian futurist stuff is like, it's showing this like kinetic energy. It's showing this like speedy, fast movement of things, and the mechanization of things, and it's kind of aestheticizing that. It's creating like an aesthetic of motion and speed and mechanization and acceleration, or at least that's my reading of it. And I think that so at least my sort of simplistic like thing is, I really like the intervention that art made in the 1850s, right, through Sportsman sketches and Harry Beecher Stowe. I'm very troubled by the intervention that Italian Futurism made in the teens and 20s, and it is with that background that I think about what can art do now? What is the role that art should play now? I'll stop there. Would love to hear your thoughts about all this.
First of all, it's really interesting that you are looking at, well, first of all, a disclaimer. I'm definitely not an art historian, but there has been one, I guess, historical arc that's been very important to the development of the premises upon which I have based, let's say, the last 10 years of my practice. And that's the historical arc precisely that you kind of delineated from this sort of late industrial era, at least in the context of the Western world, so 1850s and late 19th century. Then 60s, and I'll explain in a second why, and then 80s and 90s. And so what we have there is a very particular approach to the ontological status of what the art object is, that has been kind of evolving in an iterative manner. And arguably that evolution started with such artists as Courbet and Manet, who, interestingly, so in your account, you're looking at the content of the artworks. And I never actually thought about the content of the artworks, because the thing that has always interested me the most about those artists is that they were, their mission was to reject the formal institutional constraints that put a particular definition as to what art is on a kind of representational formal level. And this kind of formalist sort of undoing and challenging of the norms of what makes a painting worth looking at, what is good sculpture. And, the way that they positioned themselves through the Salon des Refusés, which was this kind of counter-institutional formation in Paris. That's the kind of really interesting aspect for me in terms of modernist art history, that what started, I guess, arguably with these artists is an understanding of art as a specific type of crystallization around how we legitimize what is reality, right? And what is reality that is worth engaging with. And, I think there, the sort of revolutionary aspect is, for me, is not so much in the content of the work, although you're probably right. Their kind of interest in specific subjects and their plight and the systemic injustices that underwrote the struggles of these people are incredibly important. But it's the sort of revolutionary aspect of changing the terms on which the art object is defined that is quite interesting to me. And that's, in a sense, maybe the genesis of this larger claim that has been then made by conceptual artists and many contemporary artists as well, that apart from an aesthetic representational operation, art is a performative operation. And the performing of the rejection of certain rules and pointing to new possibilities is part of what art offers. And so then when we kind of shift towards 20th century, early 20th century, and there's some kind of like cliche figures like Duchamp. And Duchamp with the Fountain and many other of his artworks, or their artworks, we don't quite actually know who or what Duchamp was, but the gesture there is almost like a kind of hyperbolic intensification of what Manet and Courbet started, insofar as Duchamp made it possible to say that there's something about art that allows for a semantic kind of authority where we can, as long as the author says that it's art, it should be perceived as such. And that kind of transformation in understanding what is art, if it's not some kind of definition of formal rules, led to a lot of possibilities in the 1960s that are most prominently explored by the conceptual art movement. And at the same time, we understand that once we then get to the late 20th century, the 80s and the 90s, the sort of merging of art as an empty set, so to speak, in which you can like literally, you can put whatever parameters into it. And as long as the author determines something as art and an audience perceives it as art, it is art. When we get to the 80s and the 90s, there's a slightly uncanny coalescing that happens between the kind of neoliberalization of the political environment and art as this very kind of ultimately like individualized, authoritative statement on the behalf of the producer. And where we get to in the 90s is that there is a proliferation of contemporary art institutions around the globe that is sort of boosted by the fact that, kind of the liberal cosmopolitan project is seen as a success with the fall of the Soviet Union, and somehow kind of contemporary art with this sort of very, I don't want to say libertarian, but like very kind of liberal ontological identity becomes a mascot, the cultural mascot of this global cosmopolitan project. And this opens up really interesting, avenues in the 90s in terms of, on the one hand, art all of a sudden becoming, a manifestation of a wider sociocultural global paradigm. On the other hand, it's sort of, it's merging with power becomes a bit of an uncomfortable reality that I think not many people were attuned to. I mean, it's, only, I guess, in the 2000s that you start getting a lot of critical literature where that relationship between the dominant social and economic structures and the philosophies that drive them is kind of analyzed in terms of, oh, wow, that's kind of what contemporary art is as well, if you think about its ontological status. At the same time, I also think that this has opened up a lot of possibilities for the art field to really kind of question its ethos as far as the relationship to these structures is concerned. And I think by the time we get to now, right, to the point where we are, it sort of means that the proximity to this historical arc of technosocial development that got us to this moment in time, art's proximity to it, means that it's also very well positioned to play with this configuration in ways that can challenge our understanding as to where we should go next. So it's almost like now we got to a stage where our awareness of the proximity between the ontological status of art, what is happening in society, on wider terms, that awareness, it gives us an opportunity to do things in a sort of much more strategic manner. And I think this is where my kind of fascination with strategy arises from, is that once we admit that art isn't this autonomous, separate kind of evolutionary arc, but is actually tightly embedded both in terms of its ontological presumptions, but also in terms of how it aligns with various power actors. Once we admit it, it means that the only real possibility we have is to be strategic about how we further evolve art as a practice and the infrastructure that makes art production, art distribution, and art as an economic reality, a reality. And, this is where we come to our collaboration, which is why questions around ownership becomes so incredibly important, because that's a very clear point of intervention that is strategic and that has a potential to make an important precedent in society, not just for the art field, but for society more generally. But another point that I really wanted to make in relationship to this, I guess, this arc of rejecting the norms that starts with Monet, goes into Duchamp, conceptual art practices. And, I think there are also different kind of milestones that one can draw up depending on which artists one likes. And it's a bit of a pity that this particular one is a bit of a male-dominated one. You could have an alternative art, but it's sort of, I guess, on a kind of levels of what the milestones represent, it would be still the same. It would mean kind of the same type of thing. But what else is interesting, if we really think about kind of contemporary art as dissolution of any endogenous criteria for what art is, and kind of complete reliance on the authorship aspect and exogenous aspects, such as, does this work get accredited as work by curators and the institutions and the market? And if so, yes, it probably has the status of art. So the sort of the lack of internal criteria and the inability to kind of question anything further that is formal and kind of limiting on a formal level means that you need to start questioning something more macro than the artwork itself. And so this is where I think the questioning of the infrastructures that make art possible as a phenomena comes into play. So my definition of art at this stage is something that actually doesn't have outer bounds. So in some more ways, I am, totally within the lineage that I have just described. And so far, I think that's the most exciting thing about art, is that it is all-encompassing. And there is no outer boundary at the moment. But if we're to be strategic as to what artistic practice should be in this historical moment in time, then we need to take the technosocial infrastructures very seriously, because these are the most defining and parameter setting aspects for our societies today.
That was amazing. There's so much there. But I wonder if you could just say another word about what you mean by sort of art merging with power or connecting with power. Could you draw that out a little further?
Yes. So I think there are different levels at which we can understand this, but ultimately, they're interconnected. So, there's the obvious one, and I'm sorry to call this obvious, like the one that you mentioned is the obvious one around the futurists, right? So effectively futurists, as you said, they aestheticized specific aspects of technological progress and really celebrated them and made it very aesthetically clear that this is a good thing, right? So there is this sort of representational celebration of progress as being identified with the existing technological innovation or developments. And it's interesting you use the term accelerationist, and that's a term that has had various connotations associated with it in the recent decade. It's closely kind of associated with the writings of Nick Land, who is a very controversial philosopher and, many would argue a dystopian, potentially even like right-wing leaning philosopher. But I guess the premise with, that sort of dystopian version of accelerationism is that accelerated technological progress will increasingly lead to dissolution of humanist principles and the kind of ultimate triumph of superior technologies, most often cited as advanced AI, over social order. And so sort of an incomplete dissolution of social order as we know it and the role of humanity within that order as the central organizing principle. So that's like the deep dystopian accelerationist narrative. Then there was, I don't remember years anymore, but not so long ago, probably around 2000, I guess, 12? Don't know. We'll have to fact check on that. There was the Accelerationist Manifesto that was put out by Nick Srnicek, or as some people might know him as Srnicek, and Alex Williams. And they're associated with what then, at least within the wider kind of cultural circles, although both of them are kind of political scientists and I think historians of economics, but somehow they got a lot of tractions in the cultural space. Their version of accelerationism is much more aligned with like a positive view of technology in the sense that, but not in a kind of futurist, yay, the steam engine type of thing, but an understanding that the sort of the boundaries between humanity and technology, like we shouldn't draw this as an antagonism, and that there is a connection between how humans operate in the world and the fact that we want to construct technology because that's what allows us to have, to quote the writer Ursula K, an interface with the material world. So they kind of take a more, I guess, philosophical stance towards technology, whilst being very sober about the fact that technological development and the role of technological innovation set is not going to go away. And so instead of rejecting technology, left-wing politics, and they're addressing themselves towards left-wing politics, needs to embrace a technologically progressive paradigm of society and embed leftist progressive principles into the developmental pathway of technology. And so that is known kind of as a left accelerationist take on, I guess, technology. And the reason I'm kind of going on this deviation is because there have been a number of, I guess, micro art movements since at least the 90s that way before this Acceleration Manifesto was published, that took precisely this approach to technology and really saw the art space as a potential kind of negotiation ground for developing conceptualizations of this progressively oriented technological pathways. And, we look at artworks today that address really dominant technologies that are primarily developed through obviously kind of private interests. And we see that a lot of other artists critique these technologies, and they're critiquing the downsides of what these technologies are kind of doing to society. But many are also proposing alternative ways of looking at these technologies. So, for example, artist Jakob Steensen, who uses virtual world building a lot in his practice, he sort of, instead of looking at VR through the branding slogan as like the empathy, empathy technology, which is, quite frankly, absolute bullshit. He is interested in VR as a way of creating a more kind of slow and attention-focused engagement with natural environment or aspects of natural environment that are either already extinct or are going to be extinct in the near future. And so here, maybe it's a more sophisticated understanding of what empathy could be, but I guess what he's offering is a different lens on the role of VR. And that's a minute contribution. But if we kind of think in terms of wider repercussions and precedent setting, it does seem significant to have at least some space in society where even these like marginal experiments and marginal views can be nurtured and born, and hopefully, taken up by other actors outside of the art field. And this act of being taken up, that's also like an infrastructural design question. And this is why I'm really interested in the interface between the art field and external fields, is because that scaling, if scaling is the right word, has not been designed yet. And ownership could be one way in which we could understand like an alternative ecosystem through which these marginal experiments and views can be amplified by actors outside of the art field, whose missions it is to, let's say, mission-oriented organizations who are dedicated to pursuing different approaches to technology. So, so I'm not sure where we started, but this is.
It's interesting because when we were talking about these 19th century movements, you sort of made the McLuhanian, the medium is the message point, right? Which, namely, that the what's important or what's most important about those things is that they were working outside the institution. They were challenging the sort of frame of what counts as a work of art, and yet it seems to me that when you describe this VR work, you're highlighting the message, not the medium, right? You're saying, well, within this medium of VR, there's this interesting thing that the artist is doing, and I wonder whether maybe that's a challenge there. Do you think that do you think that's consistent or?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I guess in this particular example, there is sort of an inflection that takes place in relationship to an existing technology. So, I mean, there is like a wider piece there as well about how exactly this particular artist works with this technology. And there's a lot of innovative dimension that he brings to the use of this technology as well. So it's not just about taking kind of shelf-ready products and softwares and creating this message. There's a what we call at our department a kind of like full stack intervention, so to speak, which I don't actually have the details ready to go into, but it's, this is, I think that's important. So I'm happy that you focus on that. When it comes to, I think the critique element and proposals of new narratives around technologies to emerge, it's not just the discursive layer. It's not just this representational aesthetic layer. It is really important that there is kind of capacity to make interventions of different layers of the stack. But the reason we started, for example, something like the Future Art Ecosystems Project, which looks at the need to construct 21st century cultural infrastructure, there is no provision right now in the existing setup of the art field to make interventions at the different layers of the stack. Right now, ultimately, like if we're really honest about it, if we don't upgrade, evolve, reconfigure, or create adjacent art ecosystems, the current setup of institutions and market is geared towards doing very superficial narrativization around technologies that already exist, or doing really smart critique that is discursive, and a lot of it is happening, but it doesn't actually have any teeth. It doesn't bite into the deeper infrastructural parametric aspects of why these technologies are really powerful, and why slight deviations or forks or different outside criteria are required.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's something really interesting happening because, I agree with you actually. In the sense that I worry about art that kind of focuses on the message and ignores the medium, or says, hey, look at this interesting message I can send along this medium. Doesn't that make you think differently about that medium? To me, that's not good enough, right? Yeah. Because the medium should actually be the focus, not the sort of incidental, thing that we're reframing through the message or something. I'm being a little bit inarticulate, but I share. I think I'm on the same page with you, and the worry is that there are certain things about the frame, about the macro medium going on in art that are locked into place to such an extent that art can't say what it needs to say, right? So, in other words,
yes.
And what one example is like the ownership infrastructure around art, right? As long as art is like a thing that you buy and collect,
object-based commodity form.
Yeah,
right? It's that over which you have exclusive property rights. That sets certain limitations upon what the pipeline to producing this thing on a very basic logistical level and production level. It sets a lot of limitations into what this thing can be. So yes, but carry on.
No, that's just it. It's just that, we've thought about, there's all of these different, ways in which art has, crawled out of its frame and challenged its frame. Right. And, it's done that by escaping the dusty old French institution or whatever. It's done that by escaping the sort of technological frame of the particular channel it's being sent on. It's being done that it's being, it's like, in theater, you can break the fourth wall or whatever. Yeah. The actor can walk out into the audience, and then, but the legal frame, right? The sort of rules of property and, how do we commoditize this? How do we commoditize this? How do we buy and sell and transact whatever it is we're doing, those have it's not that there's been no thought about that. Of course, there's been a lot of thought about it, but it hasn't been challenged radically enough. And we basically need to, there's there's aspects of that frame that really need to be addressed quickly.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note it's not that it has not been done, right?
Yeah,
and in many ways, there have been a lot of precedents and experiments where the kind of financial and transactional elements of the artwork became the very material of the artwork itself. Within the Western or historical narrative, we could actually take the whole conceptual art movement and see it as that in many respects. A lot of the challenging that happened within conceptual art is around the framing of the object in the space, but it also kind of spilled out into the larger infrastructural and transactional economic aspects of it as well. Yet none of these experiments or one-off artworks ever became scaled as systemic realities. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think, the big question is whether art as like an individuated practice can actually achieve that sort of transformation. And I honestly think it cannot. I don't think that individuated artistic practices that are experimenting with it have the capacity to transform the larger systems within which they're embedded. And so this is where I think the scale of the organization becomes very, very important. Because it is at the scale of the organization and, let's say, the public mission of the organization that you can try to set precedents which are oriented towards systemic transformations. Not to say that, obviously the greatest thing would be like, let's write a white paper and some really friendly government will base its policy on it, right? And then all of a sudden everything is changed. That would be great if we had this kind of like top down. I mean, obviously, all the activists throwing rotten apples at me, but like that, as far as like efficiency of systemic transformation is concerned, that would be amazing. But it's unlikely to happen, and it has not happened. So there needs to be some other access point into trying to achieve systemic transformation. And my intuition is that access point is the organizational layer.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, just one more point on the sort of medium and message thing is it's interesting that it's this kind of, it's almost this head spinning thing where we're just being sort of pushed farther and farther away from the message and towards the medium. And we don't need to take this hook to go straight into the AI rabbit hole. But I mean, one interesting thing about AI is that it totally obviates the message, right? Any message that you can send on any medium doesn't matter anymore, right? It can be done. It can be computed faster. So we've just been sort of pushed warp speed towards the an examination of the medium, not the message, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think if a friend of mine made this interesting statement that Francis Fukuyama's history is over. Kind of, obviously not very well respected hot take. It's actually true now. Like history in some ways is over insofar as the way that we understood transformation to be a transformation of like iterations and meanings attached to some kind of references that we're able to validate, so to speak. So there is some kind of progression that we can track. That theory of change is probably over, and the former evolution of art paradigm reflected that sort of theory of change, where you have very particular formal aspects of art associated with particular historical eras, and as I just previously said, then there are certain kind of ontological connotations between why these formal aspects within that historical era, and you can track progression. And I guess with contemporary art already, we have this flattening out of meaning kind of, and the messages are only important insofar as they're made by someone who is institutionally legitimized. And so with AI, I think, even that goes right now. Yeah. So that's really interesting and a huge challenge, I guess, to this somewhat kind of cavalier statement that I said, that art should be everything and should be seen as the sort of almost like a black hole of potential meaning creation. But what does that mean for art in the era of advanced AI is a really big question, right? How do we then make sense of anything if we can no longer point to a clearly referenced set of premises that are being either rejected or critiqued or or otherwise somehow dealt with, which is why I think that I would say that maybe the medium is the infrastructure, is the message, is where we're getting to. And so to kind of have any sort of, I guess, in order to have any grasp on reality and to feel like you can have traction in reality, you need to look at the infrastructure and what it is doing, both on a technical level, on a legal level, on a governance level. And so in some ways that I guess techno-administrative governmental layer becomes the most important layer for art as well. So if it is no longer message making in reference to past realities, it has to be message making or message creating at the level of infrastructural protocols.
Yeah. So there's something hovering in the background here, which is this idea that of things being sort of boiled down to information or reduced to bits, reduced to ones and zeros, right? So here's what I mean by that. If you think about what it, if we think about art sort of escaping the institution, escaping the frame, if we think about the focus, shifting more and more from the message to the medium, what it starts to boil down to is you see power infrastructures behind it, basically, right? You see and perhaps even more precisely than that is you see information, right? So because the medium is always information, if it's by definition, basically, right? Anything that is mediating from one understander of something to another must be information. And so that's a sense of everything sort of being boiled down to ones and zeros. And so there's this sense of art kind of breaking the fourth wall, jumping the stage and coming to encompass everything. And there's so many things that are interesting about that. But one thing that's interesting about it is you can see that in other fields too. Yeah. So for example, for quite a while, now they have now they've sullied their own reputations to an unprecedented degree, but economists, right? For decades, economists were saying, economics isn't just economics. Economics is everything. We can explain the entire, social structure, the entire universe through economics, right? So it was this sort of imperial discipline that started to like take over all of the other disciplines. Another example of so anyway, there's this sense. I feel this sense of like, genres collapsing. And not even just the old micro genres of rock music and country music, but the genres of economics
different
and
disciplines. Art. Yeah, totally.
Exactly. Right. And I want to throw another. Okay, let me throw another collapsing genre into the mix. And then I want to return to this idea of information and talk about Norbert Wiener for a second. Norbert Wiener, sorry.
It's not my Bible. Let that not tarnish my reputation. But it's a good moment to reread this.
Yeah. And let the record show Norbert Wiener, not a German. I pronounced his name wrong at first. So anyway, okay, so another of these genres or disciplines that increasingly just looks a little increasingly squirrely to me is law, which is my background, so something that I think about a lot, right?
Yeah.
Now, one thing that's interesting about law is that if you go way back, if you go back thousands of years, right? Law was not a genre. Law was all encompassing. Law was just like, basically indistinguishable from morality. It was, what governs everything. It became a genre. It became a discipline. It became a particular kind of distinctive activity that certain kinds of institutions were responsible for, and et cetera, right? But now we, it's under this. I think that the entire idea of law seems to be challenged by the same sorts of dissolving forces that we see in art and other disciplines. Now, I think there are other conceptions of law that resist dissolution. So I just want to just for the record, I think that if you really understand a relationship between law and morality as if you understand law as sort of a subgenre of morality, and if you understand
or at
morality as this
informing, at the very least.
At the very least, mutually informing. Then I think that it's still possible to. There is another conception of. Then you can link it to morality in a way that morality might actually be the frameless thing, the thing that's impossible to enframe, the thing that's impossible to just turn into mere information. I think that's an interesting thought. I just want to put it out there in the world. But we are talking here about this sort of informationization of all these different disciplines.
May I just say something in regards to that?
Yeah.
So, and I think this comes also from rereading Wiener, and the informationization of everything. I guess terrible word. Terrible word. But it. I think the issue there isn't so much the actual act of this phenomena. The issue is that we identify entities through this kind of informational paradigm. So right. Kind of it's identifying entities through the, whatever subtotal cumulative data points that make them up from the perspective of, us as humans or from the perspective of machines, right? And as we see it now. And I think we're going to get into a lot of trouble if we continue with this sort of epistemological assumption that governs our approach to something like law, because what's important about law is exactly what you described. It's the relationship that it has with morality, but it's also certain other qualities of what law as a particular way of organizing society allows the societies to be that is important. And so rather than like seeing law as a sort of subtotal of all of the information that it kind of posits as a genre, I'd be interested in approaching it as like, what are the qualities of this reality of the law that we want to hold on to, or that we want to think like how they would need to be reconfigured in the context of something like advanced AI and its impacts on society. So, and the same thing I think goes for other disciplines, other areas. There's like a major shift, that has been latent for a very long time, arguably since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, in kind of shifting the Western epistemological lens from like object-centered perception of reality to a relation-centered perspective on reality. And when we shift it to relation-centered perception of reality, what we realize that what we actually really value, or what matters to us, is the nature of those relations and how these relations are structured. And that's the reason why we create institutions, why we create systems,
right.
etc. And that I think that shift in thinking. So interestingly, there's a really great text called, oh my God, called Systems Aesthetics, I think. And it's a text from early 1960s that talks about sort of this shift from an object-oriented culture to systems-oriented culture. And,
right.
I feel like, Santa Fe Institute for Complexity is like, a perfect representation of a space that has been exploring this at great level of sophistication for some time. So like, I cannot compete in my views with what scientists and researchers have to say there. But I feel like that sort of understanding of reality is what we need more and more. But unfortunately, it is not represented through the institutions that we currently have. So there is this sort of inconsistency. On the one hand, we created the institutions that we have, whether they're economic institutions, art institutions, or legal institutions, because we care about how society manifests itself through a structure of relationships, a particular structure of relationships. But we have still hung on to this very kind of object-oriented view of what makes something, a phenomena, a thing that we should, that we should somehow, acknowledge as real. I hope that makes sense. Like, so I guess the reason I think this is kind of a relevant perspective to our conversation is that I think art is ultimately about configuring relations and thinking very deeply about how these relations are configured. And the reason we want to hold on to art as a very particular phenomenon in society is the kind of the moral impulse that is embedded into why we would want to create a certain set of relations with certain qualities. So there is like a very kind of, I think, moral, ethical dimension to art making and art experiencing and art reality as such. And it's not about kind of moralizing, but it's the sort of the moral impulse that we also find in law, but it's just has a very different set of intentionalities embedded within it. And now we're all of a sudden we really have to question why it's important that I answer my email to you rather than GPT-4.
Right.
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 The kind of the art lens
Which is a
all of a
moral
sudden
question.
becomes important. Right. So if I actually approach my act of writing an email to you as an art act, it means that, yeah, there are trivial things that we need to decide that probably, in terms of like calendar syncing and, background information on what future art ecosystems is. And, I need to communicate, and probably GPT-4 could do that fairly well. But then there's some like wild connections that I want to make between the kind of mechanism design aspirations of partial common ownership and a certain artistic practice or project that I'm working with, and where I think there could be a synthesis that is productive.
Yeah.
And, maybe I'm kidding myself to say that this is not something that AI could come up with. Maybe, maybe there is a certain level of predictability within making that connection that could be inferred should there be a sufficiently sophisticated analysis of the various previous projects that I have done, and how I communicate with other people, etc. Perhaps it's possible, but the intentionality of doing that in that particular moment, I think, cannot be taken for granted. And so it's not that I kind of want to distinguish myself from AI, but there is something about the sort of synthesis of possibilities that distinguishes like a purely automated act that is very, let's say, intelligent, so to speak, or that is inferentially and statistically accurate, and the kind of moral intentionality that I imbue the content of the email, right, and the connections that I make. Yeah, I hope that kind of makes sense. I mean, it's not a fully developed thought, but it's, trying to kind of grapple with this idea of intentionality, morality, relation building, and what AI is proposing now, and why we're like, it's, this, what it's capable of doing now is very interesting, but somehow does not necessarily capture this aspect. But I know you disagree with me on that a little bit, because you think GPT-4 could actually do that. So I'd be curious to know like what you think about this slightly speculative take on the distinctions.
Yeah. Well, one of I think my core worry is that relationships, relationality is just another kind of object, is just another sort of complex object, basically. I'm not sure that there's something there that it is escaping the logic of, exponential, ceaseless computing superpower. So for example, it took me a minute to sort of for this to crystallize in my increasingly obsolete mind, but this occurred to me the other day. That I think that what so I'm thinking about aloud a little bit here. I request permission to revise.
As I am as well.
But,
so
yeah,
let's do it.
I think that basically what the line that has just been crossed by the large language models is quite obvious. It's just language. They've just turned language into an interface. They've just turned language into something that's completely computable. So in other words, being able to use language is now just as obsolete as being able to do mental math. Like a calculator can calculate anything that happens in language better than you can. Maybe not today, but very, very soon. Right. And that's a big deal. It's a huge deal. It's like an unbelievably freaking huge deal. Because like language, in my opinion, is basically the main thing, basically the best answer to what separates humans from the animals. Like what do humans have that like other living creatures do not have? It's language, I'm pretty sure. Is the most concise, the most accurate, concise answer. And now we have tools that are better than us at that. And I think that's why you see, people now like I heard Ezra Klein the other day talking about how people are sort of falling back on the things that humans have in common with animals as what makes us distinctive from AI. And yeah, right. I mean, that's right. I mean, that is what makes us distinct from AI. It's the things that we have in common with animals. And Descartes was trying to distinguish us from the animals. He kind of did it wrong. Now we're just looking at the problem from a different point of view. There's no inconsistency.
Why do you think the distinction from animals is important?
I don't. That's kind of my point. I mean, Descartes did.
Okay, so but you're positioning the kind of, let's say, one of the major consequences of advanced AI, the computability of language and the ability to construct these relational objects that we construct through, conversation, or through other kind of methods of using language as the interface through which we'll learn about the world, right? And now we have this kind of black box AI, right? That sort of does that for us. But so I'm not entirely sure why, because with the animal stuff, I hear you, but I think what's interesting is that it could act, there are also ways like, I've heard from colleagues who are interested in like, could AI help interspecies communication, right? So there is like kind of a speculative project there around developing better actually sense of alignment with our natural world and other species by using AI as a medium. So, there's like a positive narrative around that. But for me, that's cool. That sounds great. I'm into that. A particularly great art project. But that doesn't get to the root of the problem. And for me, the root of the problem is actually much simpler. But first, I want to hear what you think about this.
So I can clarify. I don't think that the difference between I think that humans are, I think animals are conscious beings like humans, and in that sense, the distinction is, less important than most people believe. But doesn't mean there's no distinction. It just means that there's a continuity there that is underappreciated. But where that language distinction has mattered is that the networks of human beings using language to reason through things has until now been the most powerful computing force in the world.
Not without its problems as well.
Not without it, not at all. Ask any other species.
Yeah. So I think this is something like worth remembering as well in relationship to AI. And I don't know. Sorry, but continue. I don't want to break you off, but I want to make a point after that.
Yeah. So in other words, my point about with humans and animals is that there's like a moral continuity there. But there's the distinction that language has, the significance of the linguistic advantage that networks of humans have had is purely material, not moral at all. We've just, groups of humans have been the most powerful computers on the surface of the earth for a long time. And groups of humans may no longer be the most powerful computers on the surface of the earth. Like, that's it. That's what it boils down to.
And the challenge with that, I think, is what I referred to previously when I said we can no longer feel comfortable within a paradigm where identity equals information. Or the possibility and capacity to process information is, like those are not, if we still remain committed to that model of valuing reality. So I think this is where the moral lens comes in. We're probably facing a pretty dystopian future. But I think the challenge here is then to shift the ontological lens. And this is not unprecedented. There are a lot of cultures outside of the sort of Western paradigm that we inherit that have had different ontological lenses on reality and that did not privilege the sort of informational processing aspects of it to such a great extent as we do, right? And of course, there's a sort of a link between information processing, rationality, and objectivity, right? Even though all of these things have always been highly imprecise, highly biased, and speaking of the problems that have led to groups and networks of humans being the computational processing systems that structure society, is that they've done that with very particular kind of biases embedded into understanding what is right and wrong, and then implemented these whole systems onto bodies of other humans whom they did not even consider to be humans, right? So it's and so here I think there is we are facing a kind of a dawn of there's a phase transition that is really, really profound that needs to happen, and this phase transition is ontological in nature, and purely anecdotally, I think the rise of spiritual practices in Western societies is an indication of sorts, right? That there is an attempt, at least on a kind of individual micro scale, people trying to fathom what it is outside of this computational rationalistic lens that we could identify with as a cause worth living for. But the question is if indeed there is a new kind of spiritual, for lack of a better word, let's say, phase that we need to enter in order to deal with what's happening and the disillusion of meaning as we knew it, the question becomes how does this new wave become integrated, or at least somehow systemically dealt with by our existing institutions, or are all our existing institutions doomed? And I would like to think not. I think, as with everything, important not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. But it does throw up huge questions around agency and identity that institutions, from legal institutions to economic institutions and even art institutions, would need to deal with seriously, in a way that they're not particularly well equipped to do at the moment, in part because that language is entirely missing. The language that exists right now is a very kind of technocratic language that emerges from legal thinking, political theory, or there's poetry, and there's nothing in between. And so, as far as the language challenge is concerned, I do really believe that there is a role for humans still to play in developing this kind of alternative language for a new rubric of ontological foundations for why life matters, why continuation of life matters, and why structuring of life in certain ways matters. And we shouldn't just kind of give in to this sort of dystopian vision of AI taking over everything that is human, and going into this very fearful kind of animalistic position where our amygdalas get all inflamed, and and bad things always happen as a result of that. So just as a lot of proponents of automation early on have said that yes, automation is maybe terrible when you first think about the role of human as a particular kind of labor machine. It's terrible on a systemic economic level, but it also forces us to think, what else are humans for that could be outside of being these labor machines? And I think that question is amplified n-fold, right, with the bigger challenges of advanced AI that you are alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that comes up for me that does connect to these spiritual questions, which I think are increasingly totally appropriate to talk about in public, is I used to have
only
realizations about that. No, well, I used to feel that way. I used to feel like spirituality and religion was.
But that's because you're a lawyer.
It's also because I'm a liberal. I believe it's all that kind of thing. But but basically, I think that what we need to sort of realize is that our information processing functions, our information processing abilities as individuals and even as networks and stuff is not core to who we are. Is not core to our society. That is not who we are. We are not information processors, and we never were, actually. Right? We have thought we have identified with our information processing abilities a lot throughout history.
And we have structured our economies around that.
And we have structured our economies around the hypothesis that we identify with our information processing capacities. But we are not our information processing capacities. We never were. Our information processing capacities are I struggle to find the right language here, but they are not they are not the aspect of us which is most core to what we really are. They've, in other words, they've always been sort of, information has always just been information. The information that flows through us has always just been information. It's always been tied up with the material, tied up with the processes of exploitation, for example. And so, when you talk about finding a new language, I'm with you, but I think that language might not even really be the right word for what we define.
No, I agree. Exactly. And I think when I say language, I mean a sufficiently, let's say, scalable means of not just creating meaning, but referencing something, knowing that when you reference that thing, we're broadly referencing the same thing. So it's sort of what creates some sense of kind of collective understanding, where you can have a lot of misunderstanding. And that's the whole thing about like communication and miscommunication, clear. But I guess it's just understanding that we're not, although, there's also the theory that we are in fact just like, that what we attribute to external realities is completely empirically unprovable, right? So in a sense, like we could just be brains in a vat somewhere that are perceiving everything as some form of simulation. And so it's, but I think what language has done so powerfully is create a sense of shared reality. And so whatever that other mechanism would be, it would need to have this quality of creating a shared reality. And so, we've gone far away from our conversation on art, but I think that's where it kind of loops back to art, where art, let's say in its idealized form, but also in its kind of historically ambitious, or like the ambition that art has always had historically, is to be this alternative mechanism of creating a shared sense of reality that is sometimes speculative, right? And I think that's the part of particularly kind of contemporary art practices that's super interesting, is this like kind of the imaginary aspect, like the imagination aspect of the shared reality that art creates, is that it's not just saying like, this is what it is. There's art that does that, but it's like, what if we consider this as a possibility, as a potentiality, and getting kind of as many people involved in that like imaginary space as possible. So that's maybe something that art can continue trying to do in relationship to finding this new mechanism. And I think that's very powerful. And I'm not the only person talking about it. I think there are a number of people who understand the consequences of advanced technologies such as AI, as we have discussed them, and also understand what art can do, and are kind of deeply invested in making that possible. Personally, I find myself on a more kind of, let's say, spiritually informed technocratic path insofar as I do actually want to see like what are the very practical reorientations in our current economic mechanisms that we could create that would then offer art the potential of developing this new language. So it's a bit of a meta project, but it's I guess still in my theory of change, this sort of underlying layer matters a lot. And as wonderful as it would be to just think brilliant people coming together, even like, let's say, also brilliant AI systems coming together in a circle of creators who create this new language, I think that's cool. And I'm very happy these people exist who want to do that creative project, but without a foundation that is in alignment with that project. And by the foundation, I really mean the economic principles and the legal principles through which this becomes an institutional mechanism, which this becomes a reality. I don't see that creative project going very far.
Yeah. So, you want to say a little bit more about what that looks like if we were able to create a sort of a new sort of infrastructure or a new sort of make art, or to think of art as a different kind of channel or different kind of, language through which people are connecting in this increasingly weird world?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I think art offers a possibility to bring a lot of non-obvious collaborators around the same table. And that's, a fairly banal affordance, but I think one that cannot be underestimated. It doesn't mean that something brilliant will naturally emerge from, different people talking to each other, but it's not just people. It's, it can also be various technical systems. And I think, advanced AI is going to be a seat at the table in most of these conversations, and rightly so. So there's that aspect of it. And I think when, we bring all these different people around the table, it's clear that they're all kind of bringing value from their relative communities, in the communities that they represent. And in order for these sort of collaborations to have like a longitudinal, long-term, meaningful kind of investment, it's important to think what are the economic mechanisms through which we make that happen. Yeah. And that's the reason why we're exploring partial common ownership that really has this sort of long-term perspective in mind as far as the artwork that kind of links communities that originally produce value for the art and the owners who are effectively stewards of that art. And, really thinks what is the relationship between the stewards and the original kind of value creators who, here there's no reason, I think, particularly when we're talking about highly complex artworks, why an artwork would just remain as a single art object. I think what the partial common ownership framework opens up. Those who don't know about it, please read our blog post on it. It's also, there are various resources that will be shared with this podcast. But yeah, what this framework allows for is this sort of, I call it longitudinal, but kind of this like iterative, non-object specific object-based approach to art, but really art as an incremental developmental process that may have various objects attached to different, let's say, economic transactional moments, but it doesn't need to be totally equated with those objects and can be more equated with the larger project of whatever this group of people and technical beings and, I don't know, non-human life think is a good idea, right? And that's, this is where I think the exciting part of our current technological conditions, like we can design those infrastructures with the technology that we have. And here both, let's say, from anything from like blockchain to AI to 5G networks, if these ever come about. But these are useful mechanisms. And so, useful infrastructure. And so in this way, I think we have to also be somewhat, like, I guess, left accelerationist, coming back to that reference point about the technologies that we have and what they allow us to do in order to think, how do we make something as potentially like complex sounding for a more traditional understanding of our ownership, a reality.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I'm still sort of stuck on the accelerationism thing. I'm not sure that I like left accelerationism more than I like right accelerationism.
It's the wrong word.
It's an interesting word, isn't it? Like what,
it's a terrible
it's sort of
word. I mean, it's as far as, let's say, like the zeitgeist is concerned, it's definitely a bad taste word. Like, it's not something you go screaming off the rooftops and, hope that people will have a positive reaction to. Like, everything about that notion of like acceleration just seems deeply troubling given, where we are right now. But I think it's more the ideas. It's, it's this idea of the fact that we can't help ourselves to create tools and interfaces that allow us to interact with each other and our material reality, right? And this maybe goes deeper to this conversation about what is actually, what is being. And so like maybe our particular mode of being, which we call today humanness, right? It necessitates this kind of creation of what we now call technology in order to, have systems or interfaces through which we process reality around us and through which we're able to mold reality and come together around this kind of process of molding and responding to reality. So there's something, something almost like, I don't want to say essentialist, but it's this kind of not alienating the technological from the human that I find really, really productive in this badly named approach. And also the pragmatist angle of like, well, we have these technological capabilities that, yes, are subject to interests and power that we want to contest. But let's engage with them seriously. And so, what I love about organizations such as yours is I think that's what you guys are doing, even though you have a very progressive, almost like utopian or maybe utopian vision of what a political economy should look like.
I object.
You object? Okay.
Objection.
Sorry.
No, I don't. I wouldn't say. I have never considered myself a utopian, and I don't actually. I don't think. I think that RadicalxChange's ways of looking at things are actually not utopian. They're sort of synthetic. They are looking at ways of making sort of the best possible world, which still won't be perfect, right? I don't think there's a embrace of an illusion of some sort of like, amazing future perfection.
No, that's not what I mean with utopia.
Which is what? Okay.
Maybe we have just different definitions of utopia. I mean, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe this is like as a result of coming from a place that doesn't exist in my lifetime, has been destroyed 3 times. So where like my definition of utopia is having the guts to challenge the status quo in a significant way. It's sort of, so maybe this is like a very
okay. In that sense, yes.
Sure. So perhaps I have a very low bar for utopia, but yeah. So that would be my definition.
Okay, and the reason I bristled at the word is that I associate it with naive beliefs about the future. Okay. Basically, I associate utopia, the idea of utopia, with the idea of perfectionism and perfectibility, and with groundless predictions about how great tomorrow is going to be. Basically, that's what I associate. And I consider myself a realist. I've kind of harbored this view for a very long time, and I'm increasingly feel like it's actually worth fighting over, which is opposition to optimism and pessimism. Like, I think optimism is actually bad. I just don't. I think it's like a belief without evidence, basically, as is pessimism. And as a lifelong Californian, I've basically been bullied by optimists for not being enough of an optimist for as long as I can remember, and I think it's made me and the entire world stupider. So I'm a realist, is my point, right? It's not going to be. I don't think tomorrow is going to be a gleaming citadel of eudaimonia. I don't. Maybe it will be, and maybe it won't be. That's my position.
I do want to say something in relation to that. So yes, perhaps the Utopia Association was a little bit kind of revealed actually my pessimist proclivities in terms of places of origins, because such a low bar on like what is an overly optimistic projection. but the realism part is interesting relationship to art, right? Because in some ways you can say that a lot of art is very naive, precisely because of this sort of utopian speculative aspect to it. And I would agree. And I think what we need is actually more realist art. But realist does not mean like lacking imagination or lacking, a sort of, the right kind of moral sentiment, right? That creates, the type of language that we're talking about just now. So, and the point of intervention for this realist art is the infrastructural and the protocol based. And so that's, I think, maybe a good point to end where we started. And to bring a word back from my recent Vipassana meditation retreat, I think equanimity is actually what we were talking about, right?
Equanimity. So that's it. That is it.
That is it. So maybe we're entering an age of equanimity, and that is the ground zero of whatever new kind of ontological regime that we should construct.
Yeah. Now that's a great place to end. Equanimity. I couldn't agree more.
Yes. Work diligently. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I just want to say thank you before this breaks off in a very melodramatic manner. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully some stuff makes sense. Any final words, Matt?
No, thanks.
Equanimity, great. That's a good place to end.
Stay tuned for further sort of collaborations between Radical Exchange and Serpentine. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
An immense thanks to Victoria Ivanova for joining us in this episode of Radical Exchanges and providing vital insight on the radical ways that art can help us process and respond to the current overwhelming developments in technology, and for helping to forge a collaborative partnership between Serpentine Galleries and Radical Exchange. You can find links to the recent paper she co-wrote with Matt Prewitt and Paula Berman in the show notes titled Rethinking Art Ownership, Partial Common Ownership as a Step Towards a More Symbiotic Ecosystem. Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, it would help us if you could rate and subscribe to Radical Exchanges on your favorite podcast platform. This episode was produced by G. Angela Corpus and edited and audio engineered by Aaron Benavides. The Radical Exchanges podcast is executive produced by G. Angela Corpus and Matt Prewitt. If you would like to learn more about Radical Exchange, please follow us on Twitter at RadicalxChange or check out our website at radicalexchange.org. We also invite you to continue the conversation on our Discord, where we have a variety of channels discussing topics like what you heard today, as well as partial common ownership, community currencies, soulbound tokens, and much more. There will be links to all these in the description. Thanks again for listening, and stay radical.